Now, as the war in Ukraine grinds on, Russians on the home front face increasing repression from the Putin regime. One who wouldn't be silenced is the opposition leader, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who has been a thorn in the side of Putin's government for many years. The democracy activist has twice been poisoned and now faces up to 25 years in a penal colony for criticising the war in Ukraine. His sentence will be handed down tomorrow. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Vladimir's wife, Evgenia, and I'm sorry for my pronunciation, and I hope I get better as this interview goes on. But let me ask you, first of all, have you been in touch with him? How is he? And how are you coping with this impending decision tomorrow?
We last saw and spoke to Vladimir 1 year ago in April of 2022, when before he was detained in Moscow and then arrested. Vladimir had been fighting for many years for the right to have phone conversations with his children. The first denial of that right came around Christmas time last year. I'm sure it was meant as a Christmas present. The official paper said that phone conversations with his children would impede the due legal process in the criminal case against him. And just recently, about a couple of days ago, he received yet another denial of that right, a repetitive denial. So the authorities are using this as a psychological torture, of course, by denying a man the right to speak to his kids, to have any contact with his family, by isolating him entirely from the people who love him and who miss him terribly.
And Evgenia, I was really shocked to learn as well, and I mean, not shocking what you've just outlined to us, but the fact is that the warder who was in prison with Sergei Magnitsky, who died in custody in 2009, aged just 37, and someone who Vladimir has spoken about and was very friendly with, the warder that was there at that time and who Vladimir talked about is now his warder in prison in Russia. And, I mean, that must cause you immense concern, given that Vladimir was out and about talking about this particular man across the world.
And he's not actually the only one. You'd be amazed. Vladimir has been engaged in the campaign for the introduction of the Magnitsky legislation that imposes targeted sanctions on human rights violators all over the world since 2010. Sergei Magnitsky died in 2009. So the head of the Butyrka prison, where Sergei Magnitsky was held in 2009, was a certain Dmitry Komnov. He was the one who ordered torture against Sergei Magnitsky and then denied him medical care. After Vladimir's arrest, he became the head of the pretrial detention center where Vladimir's being held. And another person in this case from the Magnitsky list is Sergei Podobrigorov, the judge. That was the same judge who sent Sergei Magnitsky to pretrial detention, unlawful detention in 2008. He is the same man who will be now trying my husband for treason and who will pronounce his verdict tomorrow. So people who have been personally implicated in the death, in the murder of Sergei Magnitsky are now handling the case of my husband, who's been fighting for the Magnitsky sanctions fiercely for years.
I mean, that offends all of our natural justice instincts, Evgenia, and the fact is that this is happening tomorrow. And are you shocked by what is being proposed, or is it something now, given your experience, that you've come to expect?
It definitely is not a big surprise, considering the situation with human rights in Russia in general.
Yeah.
Thousands of people, over 20,000 of people, have been detained over the last year for protesting against the war. According to Memorial, Russia's most respected human rights organizations and co-laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize last year, there are over 500 political prisoners today in Russia. So this 25-year prison sentence that the prosecutor demanded for Vladimir is not too much of a surprise, but it definitely shows that he is seen as a personal enemy too, because they could have, you know, the first accusation against him for spreading the so-called fake news about the war in Ukraine would have been enough to send him to prison for 15 years. This is what the authorities are now doing in Russia, sending people to prison for up to 15 years for standing in the street with a slogan that says no war, for example. So this would have been enough, but they added the charge of high treason to that, and another charge of being affiliated with an undesirable organization. They labeled him as a foreign agent. All this shows to me that they consider Vladimir their personal enemy, and they do that. They hate him so much, and they're so afraid of him because of those sanctions and because of how effective this measure has become.
And Evgenia, Vladimir is a dual passport holder. He's a British passport holder as well as a Russian passport holder. But he chose to go back to his home and to stand up against the regime there. You must be incredibly proud of him and what he has achieved, particularly in terms of the sanctions that he has been arguing for around the world. And what is your message to the Russian authorities today as they seek to imprison your husband in a penal colony?
Well, my message to the Russian authorities and to the regime in Moscow is that they are overly optimistic by giving my husband a sentence of a quarter of a century. They're overly optimistic. They're not going to be here in 25 years. They're not going to, I hope that they're not going to be here in 5. So I know that this regime will collapse, and I will continue Vladimir's work. I will continue doing everything that is in my power to make sure that more human rights violators are sanctioned all over the world. And I do hope that I can put my small nail in the coffin of this regime, even if it's a very, very small nail, but I'll put it deep. But I also have a message for the British government. Vladimir is indeed a dual citizen, and I would very much like to see the British government more involved, more engaged in the defense of Vladimir. I would like the British government to stand up with my husband, and not only because he is a British citizen. You know, he's not a Canadian citizen, but Canada was the first country to impose targeted Magnitsky sanctions against perpetrators in Vladimir's case, against those who have been unlawfully persecuting and prosecuting him. This measure was then followed by the United States. The country also imposed personal sanctions against those involved in Vladimir's persecution. I would like to see the British government to do at least this, to impose sanctions on those people who are violating the rights of Russian citizens, for those Russian citizens who stand up against the regime, against all odds, who stand up and fight against all risks. And like you mentioned, Vladimir was poisoned twice, so he survived 2 assassination attempts, and still he continued his work. He continued his work raising awareness about the nature of Putin's regime around the world. He continued his work trying to make everything that he could so that sanctions could be imposed on human rights violators. And I believe that democratic countries should stand with people like this and defend them.